Magazine and PE Corporate Services. My name is Alan Hosking. I'm the Executive Editor of HR Future, and with me today I have got Martin Westcott, who is the Executive Chairman of PE Corporate. I have also got Melanie Trollip, who is the Chief Executive Officer, and joining us from London is John Pymm, who is an Executive Compensation Executive. We're going to be discussing a very contentious issue, which is the wage gap. This is a worldwide issue, and what we're going to be looking at is we're going to ask John for an international perspective to contextualize things, and thereafter we're going to be looking at it from a local perspective. The wage gap in terms of socio-economic and socio-political issues, very sensitive. So join us, stay with us, and we trust that you're going to enjoy the time with us together. John?
Thank you very much, Alan. I think probably the first thing we should do is maybe start defining exactly what the issue is and what the international perspective is. And the international perspective is probably still at quite an early stage in terms of really doing something about it. I think discussions around wealth disparity, around income pay ratios, have been happening for a number of months, if not years. And the question arises, well, what have companies globally done about it? And to date, there are only really three countries that have actually sort of tackled this issue to some extent. India introduced some legislation back in 2013. The USA, on the back of the Dodd-Frank Act 2010, have actually just formalized some SEC regulations, which will be coming into place in 2018. And the UK and indeed Europe have had some discussions around CEO pay ratios, but actually have put the ratio itself back a little bit and put some other things perhaps forward. So it's been a discussion in a number of countries, but there are only very few countries who have actually put something forward in terms of what the pay ratio itself actually is. And there are others indeed, if we look at Latin America, then who don't have the degree of disclosure around executive pay to even think about what the individual pay is for one executive, never mind about the ratio between the highest perhaps earning individual and the other person, whoever that person might be. But one question is, well, how do you define the comparison? What might be the 2 points that you would take out on the curve? And for countries at the moment, certainly India and the US, they've defined it as the highest individual compared with the median individual in an organization. And there's all sorts of issues to deal with the technicalities of how you calculate that differential between the two individuals. Now, if you look at India, for example, at the very top of that pay differential, you might see some pay differentials of 1,000 plus to 1. In the US, there are some other pay ratios which have been calculated, for example, with regard to the S&P 500 of 373 times to 1 on average for that group of companies. In the UK, the FTSE 100, somewhere between 130 to 149 to 1 has been quoted as an average as well, although we don't have that specific calculation in our legislation. But as little as 5 and as high as 1,000 can be the ratio between the uppermost pay and either the median, the average, depending on how you calculate it. So whilst there is great discussion about the CEO pay, the ratio between the average worker or indeed the lowest paid worker in an organization, I think the question, which is probably on a lot of people's lips, is what's the degree of change over time, and how should that change in the future? So there's probably a recognition that certainly over the last 15 to 20 years the gap has got wider, and therefore the feeling is that this may be unsustainable going forward. The question is, what should be done about it going forward? And currently some governments, such as India and the US, believe that disclosure is indeed the best thing of this issue, and this will take a natural course once the information is out in the marketplace. Does that give you some idea of the, Alan, of the, so some of the international perspectives out there?
Indeed, John. Thanks so much. When you talk about the gap getting wider, what are the reasons for that? What would you see as trends that are contributing to that widening of the gap?
Well, I think in terms of trends of widening of the gap, there is one thought around the companies becoming larger, the complexities of running a large organization become, a larger accountabilities and responsibilities for the particular individual involved, and consequently, the level of pay for the individual seems to rise. Another thought is the availability of information relating to CEO pay is very public, and certainly, as we found in the UK when our legislation in the early 2000s related to disclosing more information about executive pay, what we found was not that executive pay went down, but that if anything, executive pay went up following that disclosure, which is slightly an unintended consequence of that information. Globalization, I think, is another aspect of the equation and some of the issues involved, in that the CEOs are often more mobile, and can not only cross companies more easily, but cross regions more easily, and might be regarded as a global workforce. And so there is movement up towards what might be called as the sort of highest common denominator. And at the other end of the scale, technology involved in businesses nowadays perhaps removes some of the aspects of lower paid jobs, and that means that it's not as free, I think, as an economy in terms of a competing market and the ability to move talent at lower levels as it is to move talent at higher levels with higher technical competencies and skills. There are a number of aspects involved in this equation. It's not simple by any stretch of imagination, but what companies do today, not just one particular region, but a lot of them worldwide, is they're very, very careful when they set chief executive and indeed director pay. They look at information relating to surveys, they look at information relating to comparator peer companies, they think about what the position within the general employee workforce is. They're very careful as a remuneration committee to make sure they're making a decision which takes a number of factors, benchmarking of which is one, into the final relationship between pay, the company, and its overall workforce. That's also to say, of course, that the structure of pay for the very top of the organisation is quite different from lower down the organisation. One question is, should it be so? But the structure of pay at the top of the organisation often involves a significant proportion of pay in variable pay in some form or another. So we will see short-term incentives and indeed long-term incentives, particularly long-term incentives which are stock-based and therefore are very related to the increase in stock price. So the variability of top pay is huge compared to the variability of pay lower down the organisation.
John, before I move to Martin and Melanie for a local perspective here in South Africa, just one last question to you. We talk about the increasing complexity and globalization impacting on the executive pay. Are we, by implication, then saying that we're facing a situation going forward where executive pay will just run away from the pay at the bottom, so to speak?
Well, I think what we've seen in the past is that in terms of during the debate, for example, for the legislation around disclosing more on pay for UK executives, when the most recent legislation was put in place giving shareholders even greater power in the UK. They have a binding power over the remuneration policy that's set in the remuneration report of companies, and there is at least one vote, perhaps two votes, maybe even three votes on executive pay at an annual general meeting of a company. That during that discussion and debate, the question of whether there should be a CEO pay ratio was raised right at the beginning of the discussion document. And at the head of that discussion document, just below the question, it showed the increasing gap from 97 through to 2009, I believe. And in 97, 98, the pay ratio between the average worker and the average FTSE CEO pay was about 47 times. As you moved forward to 2009, it had almost doubled. So over that period of time, there was already a moving up. Will it continue to move in that direction? I think there is a concern that it might do so, and discussions that we've had, both in Europe and indeed in the UK, and those discussions around the US and indeed India, put the topic out into the public, so that perhaps perspectives can be changed a little bit, and some thoughts around why it's happening and what companies can do about it, and the effects of an ever-widening gap.
Thanks, John. I'm going to be moving to more of a local South African perspective. Martin, you're very aware of the inequalities that we're facing in our country. It's a sensitive issue, highly emotive. We've got unions that do not have a comfortable relationship with management. What is your take on the wage gap in South Africa?
Alan, I'm fascinated by the extent to which our history here tracks to some extent the history in the developed countries. John has related the UK experience. We've been measuring the wage gap, and we've measured it in a fashion which is unique to South Africa, I think, but nevertheless valid and interesting. What we've measured, and we've gone back about 20 years, and we've pulled this data out of the regular national surveys that we produce, and we've measured the differential between the chief executive pay in an intermediate-sized company, and in the South African context, we would define that as a company with approximately 2,500 employees, probably 500 million to $1 billion in turnover, and if we go back and we've measured that as a proportion of worker pay, and we've taken a basic skill level worker, somebody in the Patterson A band in the local context, that ratio, if you go back to the mid-90s, and that's just after South Africa became we installed a democratic government for the first time. And that ratio around there was in the mid-30s, sort of 35-1. And in saying that, I'm excluding the incentive pay or variable pay component in the executive package. We measured initially just the guaranteed or fixed pay. That ratio crept up quite quickly, and by the sort of mid-2000s, we were looking at ratios of around 50 to 60 to 1. Quite a dramatic increase. The reasons behind that were probably not dissimilar to the ones that John related in respect of the UK. We were looking at an open labour market for the first time. We moved from a closed economy under apartheid to an open economy accessed by the world, and we had free flow to a larger extent of executives from South Africa overseas and from overseas back here. Many of the multinationals, of course, as you know, came into the economy. And they transferred people in, and that tended to create a boost in pay as well. So we saw that ratio going right up to, as I say, in the mid-60s to 1. That's leveled out over the past probably 4 or 5 years, and it's been pretty static at that level. But if one wants an additional comparative, one can quite quickly look at the situation in listed companies. And if you take the top 20% of listed companies in South Africa. I'm talking of, for example, the 4 major banks, the 2 major cell phone companies, MTN and Vodacom, part of the Vodafone Group, Shoprite, Checkers, companies of that size and shape. If one takes the total package, the total earnings of a chief executive in those situations, and use the same Patterson A-band basic skilled level worker, in other words, you're looking at ratios right now of over 300 to 1. So it's quite dramatic. That ratio, if you track it over the last decade or so, it went up from the 200s up to around 340. I think it peaked at just pre-2008, which was, of course, the time at which we had the global downturn, and it dropped down to just below 200 and has crept back up to 300 now. I think the reason for the dramatic fall from 2008 to 2009 was largely due to the fact the impact of the global recession on incentive pay, particularly short-term incentive bonuses, and of course the drop in share prices, which impacted long-term incentive earnings as well. So one's had quite an interesting parallel. If you look at the impact of that on society and organizations generally, one of the factors in the mix as well is the fact that since the publication of the King 3 report, and that was over 10 years ago now, and as a JSE listing requirement for public companies and part of the Companies Act, companies are now required to disclose executive remuneration. So it's pretty in the open out here, and therefore the unions have had access to those figures, and the unions have been very quick to align that pay gap in organizations with the wealth gap in society, which of course is an equally sensitive issue, given the country's particular history and given the fact that unemployment is massive and the low level of education or lack of success of the education system and the unemployability of many people is equally sensitive. It's meant that at the remuneration committee level, a lot of the debates we attend at that level when assisting companies, you will find that committees these days are focusing on that differential. It's not part of what companies are required to disclose at this point in time. There's a little bit of speculation that the new King 4 report, which is due out at the end of this year, might place the onus on companies to report that statistic. And I don't know whether they'll follow the American example, which John alluded to, or the Indian example, where it would be a comparison between median pay and across the organization, or average pay per worker, rather than the bottom of the organization. But the fact of the matter is it's possible that it might need to be reported. I think the other thing we need to bear in mind when you look at pay differentials is it is a relative measure. It's very useful to look at trends over time if you're talking about the same thing, but it's not a particularly helpful absolute measure, in the sense that if you look at the pay differential between a typical manufacturing or mining company, a smokestack industry, which dominated our stock exchange 30 years ago, you will have a large component of relatively basic skilled and semi-skilled workers. If you compare that, for example, with a service industry, an IT company, for example, you will find that the preponderance of low-level workers in that organization might be in the Patterson C band, in other words, the skilled band. So you'll have a very definite difference between those two, and that immediately will impact that ratio, as will differences in regions, differences in various industry sectors, and factors like demographics in a particular region as well.
Thanks, Martin. Melanie, I'm going to throw something at you. We all accept that there is this inequality, this wage gap. The move to greater transparency is very helpful and worthwhile development. But is that going to change anything? What do you think we need to do to actually address this issue?
I think it will definitely have a focus on the issue at hand. Like Martin said, your remuneration committees are all grappling with it. It is on the agenda. So it's not something that we can sweep under the carpet at this stage. So we are going to have to deal with it. And like John said, the gap is increasing, although executive increases in South Africa has been lagging that of the lower levels of staff, because it's percentage based, it is not actually having the impact of reducing that gap as such. I think just like when King 3 came out, when people were requested to disclose executive pay, if it comes as a reporting requirement, I think companies will focus on it more, and they will have to report on it and address it. I think the most important thing is for companies then to compare these ratios within their own industry. And even then, it is challenging because business models are different. A lot of organizations, for example, in the IT sector, they would outsource a whole lot of the lower skilled employees or services. So the ratio there is going to be very different. But I foresee in this issue that it is most certainly going to be top of mind, and people will be focusing on that, and hopefully some action will be taken to improve the scenario. What we have seen, John mentioned it as well, is the shareholder activism, where executive pay is under scrutiny, and also one can say yes, there's a demand for executive skill, and they are mobile, and that is why they demand such high salaries. But at the end of the day, if it is not aligned with the performance of the organization, then there will be a lot more pressure on organizations to close this.
There's been a lot of talk about equal work for equal pay. Does that have a role to play in addressing the wage gap?
That is more about internal equity. That is a fair wage for a particular role that you are fulfilling. In that instance, it has a racial bias, and it has a gender bias. So they're trying to, with that legislation, they're trying to remove those inequalities. So it's got a different focus, but at the end of the day, that is just to eradicate discrimination.
Okay, thank you. John, to come back to you now, you've been listening to the conversation with regard to local issues. Any comments, any observations from you?
Well, I don't think the issue will go away by merely disclosing. I think it's very difficult, as both Martin and Melanie has stated already, that there isn't one golden ratio. I think we've already seen from the experiences in India, which have had this ratio perhaps for the last 2 years, there's actually quite little comment from companies in their narrative around their disclosures. There's not one golden ratio, but if it is a disclosure that's required, and to the extent that disclosures are required in respect of employee differentials in some way or another, it does focus the minds of both the compensation committee and the investors, as Melanie said, in terms of shareholder activism. So it does start to change perceptions, and also results in certain actions. We've seen certainly at the median level in respect of fixed pay for the period during which probably 2008 to 2010, maybe 2011, the median increases in fixed pay for the executive group was 0% during that period of time, whereas employees were getting pay increases, although very low ones compared with inflation. So that there was an acceptance, there was a concern around what was happening to the employee population. But golden ratio figures, been quoted to sort of 20 to 1, 100 to 1 is very difficult, depending on the industry, to come up with one particular issue. I think the other thing which is quite pertinent from the UK, you mentioned about sort of equal pay for equal work, and the UK is currently taking one step further in the agenda requirements within the UK, in that there will be disclosures required relating to differentials between pay between men and women in the UK, both as a whole within the organisation and relating to various quartiles within the organisation. So we're expecting, certainly on the gender bias perspective, that will be raised on the corporate agenda over the next few years, and you're seeking not just the question of pay, but the question around opportunities to get pay, the question around opportunities to get skill, the questions around the opportunity to progress your career in an organisation and receive the appropriate training in order to receive the rewards that may warrant. So there are other questions which I think society is tackling as a whole, not just the pay gap and wage gap, but also still questioning issues around racial and gender bias and how companies should disclose that they're dealing with these issues across the board.
Thank you, John. Martin, one of the issues in South Africa is the sensitivity about our exchange rate. Now, an argument that is raised in favor of keeping executive pay at a certain level is that we need to be able to attract and retain the best talent for the country. What are your comments on that?
I think it's fair comment, certainly, Alan, that we do need to pay to get the right level of talent. We're short of skilled resources, and obviously loss of key skills at that level is critical to the organisation concerned, and sometimes to the economy as a whole. But I think also it's quite important to put the whole notion of those pay differentials across international boundaries into perspective, because I could give you examples, for example, of senior people running large organizations in this country, even within the top 20% of listed companies, where that particular chief executive might report into a chief executive responsible for an EMEA region, for example, who in turn would report into a chief executive maybe in the UK, maybe in the USA, who is then the group global chief executive. And obviously, in my example, the South African chief executive is something like 2 or 3 or 4 grades down from the top person in the US. So when you start drawing conclusions between the 300 to 1 ratio that might exist in the US and the 300 to 1 ratio that might exist here, one has to take that kind of comparison into account. The other factor, which is so material here, is the extreme sensitivity about the wage, about the wealth gap in society, and the parallels, which we mentioned briefly earlier, with the pay gap in organizations. You know, we have a raging economic debate in South Africa at the moment about whether we should be following a rather more capitalist line of attack to address the economic problems we have, or we should be going more strongly in favor of a socialistic approach. And obviously it's a function of who you talk to and which particular interest group they align with. If you look at the current national economic model, the National Development Plan, the underlying assumptions of that are that we grow the economy in a good old capitalist fashion with a little drop of socialism added in, but we grow that to create economic growth and by implication to create employment. There's an even stronger argument coming out at the moment, and within NEDLAC, where we've got the business and government negotiations going on at the moment on some of these economic issues, and in particular the issue around the minimum wage. What's coming through quite strongly, and it was reported in the press the other day, that Cyril Ramaphosa, the Deputy President, is strongly in favour of boosting the minimum wage rather than freezing executive salaries, if you like. And the intention behind that is the examples quoted, there's a well-quoted example from what happened in the Brazilian economy between 2003 and 2009, where they radically increased wages at the bottom of organizations. They created 17 million new jobs and sustained economic growth around 9% for about that period. I think it's about sort of 6 or 7 years. They've run into all sorts of trouble now, of course, with the currency being downgraded to junk status. But I think that's probably the result of the hammering they've taken because they're reliant on commodities. But it remains a very, very emotive debate in South Africa at this time. I remember doing some research for an article a little while back and reading up on Peter Drucker's comments, the management guru on wage differentials, and he mentioned he apparently quoted in 1973 that a pay differential between chief executive and worker pay of around 1 to 10 or 1 to 12 would be very reasonable and acceptable. By 1983, apparently he'd make some additional comments, or mid-80s, let's say, to the effect that, well, maybe that was a little conservative. So it's obviously been a raging debate for a very long time. And I think it'll remain on the agenda here because companies are having to buy into the problem or the issue of trying to address this social problem in industry. It's businesses try to leave this to government for quite some time now, but government isn't handling it. They're not managing it effectively, and it's beginning to impact business to the extent that business is going to get drawn into this inevitably, and it'll be hotly debated, I believe, in the next couple of years.
Thanks, Martin. We're going to wrap up, and I'm going to ask Melanie just to give a couple of concluding comments, having listened to the debate, and share her perspective.
Thanks, Alan. Listening to all of the participants, I think it is not just an issue that South Africa is grappling with, it is a global issue. I really believe that in South Africa it will be at the forefront. Organizations will be forced due to the strong labor relations aspects of it to pay attention to these matters. The international side of things, it could be, it's about the wealth gap, but also about pay equity. I think in South Africa our problem is slightly more intense, and we will be forced to address it.
Thanks so much, Melanie. John Pymm, Willis Towers Watson in London. John, thanks so much for your participation. Martin Westcott, PE Corporate Services. Melanie Trollip, PE Corporate Services. Thank you so much for your participation. I'm Alan Hosking of HR Future, and I want to thank you for joining us over this last half hour.